She was calm, elegant, unforgettable, and always just outside the frame. For years she stayed in the shadows of his perfect life. Then everything fell apart. His marriage, his legacy, his bloodline. No one knows what really happened, but they all remember her name. Subscribe. Some stories aren't told, they're buried. Laura Bennett had learned early that patience was a kind of power. Not the loud, demanding kind that filled rooms with noise and spectacle, but a quieter strength, the kind that waited, calculated, endured. She carried that patience like perfume, invisible but ever present. Her beauty was subtle but undeniable, delicate features, intelligent eyes, a mouth that rarely smiled but when it did, made people look twice. She wore her age like a tailored coat, well-fitted and elegant, revealing just enough to show that she had lived and had learned. In a different life, Laura might have married young, settled into quiet domesticity, but her choices, deliberate or not, had led her elsewhere. She had no husband, no children, and no inherited wealth. What she had was style, control, and a job that placed her within arm's reach of the life she wanted. As PR director for a renowned architecture firm in Chicago, she moved among the elite, always near the luxury, never quite inside it. Her salary paid for silk blouses and downtown rent, but never for penthouses or private jets. Her handbags were designer on sale. Her wine came from good years, but rarely from the top shelf. She lived a curated version of wealth, enough to belong, never enough to be untouchable. Then there was Graham Hudson. He was power in its most polished form. 62 years old, silver-haired, clean-shaven and commanding. The kind of man who'd been rich for so long, he'd forgotten how to say thank you like he meant it. He had a wife, of course, Alison, bland and soft-voiced, who spent most of her time organising charity brunches and managing staff. They had a sprawling estate in the suburbs, a grown son on the East Coast, and a marriage that no longer looked like a partnership, more like shared logistics. Laura met Graham during a media crisis that could have damaged the firm's public face. She fixed it in under 48 hours. He noticed her then, not just for her efficiency, but for the way she carried herself. She was composed, unsentimental, a woman who understood leverage. Soon he began inviting her to lunch, then to private events, then to nights in his suite at the Four Seasons, where he let down his guard, but never his promises. He told her he was unhappy, that Alison didn't understand him, that he needed more, someone who made him feel alive again. Laura never asked for a commitment. She didn't have to. He offered one, again and again in murmured fragments. Soon. I'm working on it. I can't keep living like this. Laura believed him, or at least she wanted to. Because beneath her cultivated detachment, beneath the cool surface, she did want more. She wanted the real life, the full life. She wanted to wake up in the house on the hill, to be the woman he flew across the world for, to stop counting the years spent in hotel robes and late-night phone calls. She wanted to stop hiding, but Graham never left. He remained exactly where he was, comfortably seated in a life that made no real demands. And Laura? She grew more polished, more poised. She sent gifts to his daughter. She helped revise his speeches. She managed crises so they never even reached his desk. She became essential, but not official. And through it all, she waited for the call, the announcement, the shift that would put her where she believed she belonged. But slowly, quietly, that belief began to sour. The years didn't just pass, they weighed. And one day, without tears or drama, Laura saw what she had refused to admit. He was never going to choose her, not because she wasn't worthy, but because he never had to. And at that moment, something inside her shifted, not in anger, but in clarity. She no longer wanted to be chosen. She wanted to choose. It happened at a company retreat in Napa, one of those carefully orchestrated weekends meant to blend business with pleasure. Laura moved through the polished interiors with the ease of someone who understood her place in the hierarchy, not at the top, but never far from the ones who were. That weekend, she wasn't expecting anything unusual. She wore her role like she always did, silent observer, elegant fixture, the woman behind the man who would never make her visible. But then she saw him. Liam Hudson had returned from Yale only a few weeks earlier, freshly graduated and burning with the kind of idealism that hadn't yet been worn down by money or betrayal. He was tall, confident, charming without trying. His hair was slightly longer than his father's, his movements looser, less calculated. But the resemblance was unmistakable. Same jawline, same quick, magnetic smile. Only his eyes were different. Graham's had grown sharp over time, narrowed by deals and disillusionment. Liam's were wide open. He noticed her from across the room before she saw him approaching. When he did, it was without hesitation, without formality. He spoke not of work or reputation, but of her ideas, her presence, her silence in meetings where she could have spoken louder. Laura had mastered the art of watching people reveal themselves, but with Liam there was no act. He wasn't hiding anything. She laughed more that night than she had in months. It was easy with him, dangerously so. She let the moment stretch longer than she should have, let his curiosity deepen, let his attention wrap around her like a silk scarf. And though she appeared surprised by it all, something inside her had already clicked into place. She knew what this could become. She didn't stop it. Liam fell for her quickly, too quickly. He believed he was chasing her, winning her, as if he were the one in control. But Laura knew better. He was a different kind of man from his father, yes, but still his son. And that meant he carried the same blind spot, the certainty that women like her didn't build traps, only waited in them. Their relationship intensified in weeks. Dinners became weekends. Weekends became whispered getaways to coastal towns, mountain cabins, sleek apartments borrowed from friends. They talked late into the night about books, about ambition, about legacy. Laura played the part with precision, never overstepping, never demanding. She mirrored his intensity, fed it back to him, made him believe that he was the first to truly see her. What he didn't know was that during those same weeks, Laura still met Graham. In different hotels now, more carefully, more rarely. But it was still happening. She kept the two worlds separate with surgical precision. Two men, two illusions, one plan unfolding. And when the silence of night wrapped around her and neither man was present, she sat at her desk and began to write. The letters were not from Laura Bennett. They were from someone else entirely, a woman who never existed, but whose story felt true enough to hurt. The voice was brittle, abandoned, raw. She wrote as if she had once been Graham's secret lover, as if she had been cast aside, as if she had become pregnant and disappeared while he built his empire without consequences. Each letter was just detailed enough to sting, but vague enough to avoid verification. She sent them to Alison Hudson, one by one, always from a new burner account, always signed with the same shaky initials. The words weren't lies, not really. Graham had betrayed women before. He had broken trust. Laura was only distilling his sins into a purer form, stripped of elegance, soaked in despair, and slowly the cracks began to appear. Alison grew quieter. Graham grew suspicious. Liam, caught in the storm's calm centre, never saw it coming. He believed he was in love. Laura, ever still, ever smiling, watched the world bend around her choices. She didn't feel guilt. She felt gravity, as if the balance of years lost was finally beginning to shift in her favour. Alison Hudson had been silent for years. She was the kind of woman who believed in restraint, in not airing private grief in public, and protecting the image of family even when the foundation had already begun to rot. She had known in her own quiet way that Graham was unfaithful. She didn't need evidence. The absences, the changes in his tone, the new shirts, the foreign colognes, they all spoke the truth more fluently than any confession ever could. But the letters changed everything. They arrived without warning, without names, only initials and pain. Each one told fragments of a story, of a woman discarded, of whispered promises broken, of a child lost in silence. They were messy, desperate, cruel in their vulnerability, and they echoed something Alison couldn't ignore, her own doubts. The handwriting wasn't real, the tears weren't hers, but the betrayal was familiar. Something inside her, something long dormant, cracked open. At first she didn't confront Graham. Instead she called a lawyer. Her divorce filing was swift and calculated. She knew exactly where the accounts were, what the firm was worth, which properties held the most leverage. Her legal team moved with cold efficiency, freezing assets, exposing affairs, and drafting a strategy that made it clear this was no plea for peace. Alison wasn't asking. She was taking. Graham hadn't expected it. He believed, like many men in his position, that silence meant submission. That as long as the dinners were served and the calendars were managed, nothing would change. But now everything was unraveling. In court filings and depositions, he lost ground daily. Half the company, the house in Winnetka, the vintage cars, the private accounts in the Caymans, his name still held weight, but his life was becoming smaller. During this collapse, Liam returned from a short project in New York to assist with firm operations. He walked into chaos. The board was divided, the staff was, and rumours swirled like ash in the air. Liam had questions about the finances, about the timeline of the divorce, and most of all about the morality his father had so often preached but never practiced. The tension between them sharpened with every meeting, every disagreement, every unspoken accusation. Graham sensed that the walls were closing in. He had always been a man of control, of presence. But now, even his voice lost authority in rooms where once it commanded silence. The only person who still seemed to stand beside him was Laura. But even that comfort was poisoned. He had begun to notice things, how Laura avoided certain topics, how her eyes lingered on Liam in ways that felt off. There were moments, flashes, when he caught something beneath the surface of her calm. Calculation. He couldn't prove anything, but a suspicion had begun to take root. And once it did, it grew quickly, feeding on every silence, every absence, every polite deflection. Laura, for her part, remained the image of concern. She sat beside him at fundraisers. She offered comfort when he complained of betrayal. She seemed confused by Alison's aggression, gently suggesting that maybe it was just midlife crisis, or grief, or hormonal imbalance. She played the role with perfection, concerned, loyal, a little overwhelmed. But beneath that performance was something colder, something far older than their affair. She wasn't surviving this storm. She was orchestrating it. Late one night, Graham showed up at her apartment, drunk and unravelling. Security let him through. He was still who he was, after all. He staggered into her building, clutching a half-finished bottle of bourbon, demanding explanations that never came. He wept, cursed, begged. He was a man unmade by consequences he never thought would find him. Laura didn't let him stay. The next morning, he was found dead at a short-term rental on the city's edge, a place he had retreated to after being locked out of his former life. The scene was clean. A toppled bottle, a blood-stained stare, a broken neck. The police called it accidental, a fall in the night, impaired judgment, an open bottle still warm. There were no signs of forced entry, no suspicious injuries, no witnesses. Liam attended the quiet memorial, pale and unreadable. He didn't ask Laura questions, he didn't accuse. But from that moment on, something between them shifted. He no longer looked her in the eyes. He no longer touched her hand without hesitation. But he stayed, for reasons she already understood. 6 months passed in silence and reinvention. After the dust of Graham's death had settled and the boardroom whispers had quieted, Laura and Liam moved in together. The townhouse they chose was minimalist and bright, with high ceilings and clean angles. It was meant to symbolize a new beginning, a future built on transparency and shared ambitions. To outsiders, they looked like a couple finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light. Laura announced her pregnancy with perfect timing. It was early spring, and the air was just starting to soften. Liam had begun to stabilize, managing new projects, seeking distance from his father's legacy, trying to find himself in a world that still regarded him as someone's son. The news of the baby, delivered with calm grace, seemed to fill the empty space between them. He proposed 2 weeks later, a quiet dinner, a velvet box, a whispered vow. She smiled but gave no answer. Not yet. Laura wasn't stalling. She was waiting. The envelope arrived one morning, slipped through the mail slot with no return address. Liam found it first. Inside were printed photographs, old, grainy, but clear enough. One showed his father and Laura in the lobby of a boutique hotel, his hand grazing her back. Another captured them at a rooftop restaurant, heads bowed close together. The timestamps told a story that stretched back years. Folded into the stack were screenshots of messages, intimate, unmistakable. Words from his father, responses from her. He didn't speak of it immediately. He carried the envelope for 2 days, reading and rereading, staring at Laura while she moved around the house with effortless calm. He watched her sip tea, organize a drawer, fold linens. Her face betrayed nothing. A second envelope arrived, this time addressed to his mother. Alison called him that evening. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence, as always, carried weight. He understood that something permanent had shifted, and then came the blog post. It was anonymous, but surgical in detail. A story told from the perspective of a friend of the family who had witnessed the destruction of 2 generations by a single woman. It chronicled the affair, the betrayal, the tragic ending. Names weren't used, but everyone close to the firm understood the subtext. It spread within hours. Screenshots made their way to investors, colleagues, clients. Questions followed. Meetings were cancelled. A position was suspended. Liam's phone filled with unread messages. His inbox turned cold. Through it all, Laura remained composed. She said nothing. When he finally asked her quietly, in a tone filled with disbelief rather than anger, she listened without expression. That night, she packed a small bag and left. She was gone for 2 weeks. No calls, no texts, no explanations. She vanished with the same precision she had used to plan everything else. Liam tried to trace her, contacted friends, hired a discreet investigator. Nothing. She had left no trail. When she returned, it was unceremonious. She walked through the door like someone who had simply gone out for air. Her posture was relaxed. Her tone was even. She unpacked in silence, placed her shoes neatly by the door, and sat by the window with a glass of water. Later that evening, she told him that she had lost the baby. Her voice held no tremor, no sorrow, only finality. Whether it had been a miscarriage or something else entirely remained unclear. He asked once. She gave no details. After that, he stopped asking. Something between them fractured, quietly, without confrontation. The engagement was never mentioned again. The ring stayed in its box. Laura moved through the days with gentle detachment. She didn't offer comfort, nor seek it. She simply existed, as if grief, guilt, and love were foreign currencies she no longer accepted. And Liam, still tethered to her by confusion, by the remains of longing, stayed, for reasons he couldn't name. Liam left without warning. After weeks of silence and avoidance, he packed a single suitcase and drove west toward the Pacific. He didn't tell Laura exactly where he was going, and she didn't ask. The distance between them had grown so vast, so weightless, that his absence felt less like a departure and more like a final breath, leaving a room that had already been emptied. He stayed somewhere along the Oregon coast, in a rented house with salt-streaked windows and creaking floorboards. Days blurred into one another. He didn't answer calls. He avoided emails. He walked along cliffs in the early mornings and fell asleep in the afternoons with books he never finished. The silence suited him. There was nothing left to say. Laura, meanwhile, re-emerged, somewhere entirely new. She moved to another state, another city where her name meant nothing and her history was just a shadow she could edit or erase. There, she began to build something different. She rebranded herself as a media strategist, but not in the corporate sense. She became a coach for women, specifically women navigating life after betrayal, divorce, or abandonment. Her message was simple: resilience, clarity, independence. Her workshops filled quickly. She dressed in neutrals, spoke in measured tones, and projected a calm authority that was difficult to challenge. Her social media presence was meticulous: soft filters, quiet music, quotes about boundaries and worth. She hosted webinars, appeared on podcasts, collaborated with self-help influencers. Her book, still in progress, was already being excerpted online. Titles like Rebuilding Without Permission and The Strength of Starting Over gained traction. She was no longer the woman behind powerful men. She had become her own institution. Her story, of course, was curated. There were no mentions of Graham, no allusions to scandal or loss, only vague references to a past relationship that nearly cost her everything. Her followers didn't ask for more. They were drawn to her restraint, her elegance, her poise. They saw her not as someone who had escaped something dark, but as someone who had transcended it. Then, during a live seminar at a boutique conference in Denver, she noticed a girl in the third row. Young, maybe 23, too formally dressed for the occasion. Her posture was tense, her hands stayed folded in her lap the entire time, but it was the eyes that caught Laura's attention. Wide, fixed, full of recognition. She knew her face. It took Laura only a moment to place her. The girl was Alison's niece, someone she had seen at holiday functions and family fundraisers long ago. She had been a quiet child then, always watching, rarely speaking, and now she was here, grown and searching for answers she hadn't yet found the courage to voice. Their eyes met across the room. Laura didn't flinch. She kept speaking, her rhythm uninterrupted. Her expression didn't change, but her mind calculated the potential threat in precise detail. The girl wouldn't say anything, not publicly, not here. There was too much shame baked into the family name now, too much scandal buried just beneath the surface. To dig any of it up would mean exposing not just Laura, but everyone connected to that past. No one wanted that, least of all Alison. Laura finished the talk to quiet applause, accepted compliments with grace, and exited the room calmly. Outside in the hallway, she paused by a tall window and looked out at the city below, clean, sunlit, unfamiliar. The past wasn't gone, but it was buried deep enough, and no one was going to dig it up without choking on the dust. A year had passed, and Laura lived alone in a house by the lake, nestled between tall pines and the stillness of undisturbed water. The house was small but precise, wood and glass, clean lines, neutral tones. It reflected her current state of being, unadorned, deliberate, self-contained. There were no signs of guests, no clutter of shared life, only one toothbrush in the bathroom, one wine glass in the sink, one coat by the door. She rarely left the property. Groceries were delivered, calls were unanswered. She had no presence in the town below, except as a name on property records and utility bills. The neighbours referred to her as the quiet woman by the lake. No one ever saw her with company, no one asked questions. Inside, her days unfolded in slow, purposeful repetition. She read, she walked the narrow trail behind the house, she cooked simple meals. She didn't cry, she didn't smile often. But there was no visible sadness either. It was as if something inside her had burned out, not violently but cleanly. Whatever once drove her had reached its conclusion. There was no more need for strategy or damage control or disguise. On her desk in the study, there were only 3 personal items. The first was a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the corners. It bore Liam's handwriting, untouched since the day it arrived months ago. She had never opened it. She had no intention to. The second was a book well read, thick with underlined passages and quiet notes in the margins. A story about survival, about reinvention, about women who vanish and become something else entirely. The third was a single earring, delicate and expensive, the mate to which had been left behind in a hotel room the night Graham died. She hadn't worn either one since. No investigators came knocking, no lawsuits followed, no consequences ever reached her door. Everything had been done too carefully, too quietly for that. Her fingerprints were on nothing. Her name appeared nowhere it shouldn't. What happened had been orchestrated in shadows and carried out in silence. There was nothing to chase, no one willing to dig deeper. Too many people had something to lose by remembering her clearly. She had not disappeared. She had simply outlived the noise. She didn't think often of the men. Graham, Liam, even the faceless lawyers and executives who once surrounded them. Their lives had crumbled in her wake, but she felt no satisfaction in that anymore. Only distance. The memory of it all had dulled into abstraction, like an old movie she no longer needed to finish. Sometimes in the late afternoon she sat by the window that faced the lake. The water was always still at that hour, reflecting the sky in exact, unforgiving detail. She liked that. The silence, the sharpness of light, the refusal of nature to soften anything for her comfort. She would sit there for hours, her gaze steady but unfocused, as if watching a life that no longer belonged to her. And in those moments she understood something simple. To be happy did not mean to be loved. It meant to be untouched.